Imagine standing amidst the ruins of a once great palace, its towering walls reduced to rubble, its vibrant halls silent for over 3,000 years. This isn't the setting of a fantasy novel, it's the stark reality left behind after one of the most dramatic turning points in human history, the Late Bronze Age collapse. Picture mighty empires like the Egyptians, Hittites, and Mycenaeans, societies that had mastered art, architecture, and international diplomacy, suddenly crumbling into oblivion. Thriving trade routes fell silent, writing systems vanished, and entire ways of life were erased almost overnight. What could have caused such a widespread and catastrophic failure? How did civilizations that had stood for centuries disintegrate so completely? And perhaps most intriguingly, what can this ancient collapse teach us about the challenges we face in our interconnected modern world? This was the first truly global crisis, a perfect storm of environmental disasters, economic fragility, invasion, and social unrest that swept across the Mediterranean and Near East around 1200 BC. It's a story not just of destruction, but of unexpected alliances, as former enemies found themselves forced to cooperate in the face of common threats. Kingdoms that had once exchanged gifts and sealed treaties now fought for survival alongside their rivals, their fates bound together in a shared struggle against forces they scarcely understood. The end of the Bronze Age didn't just close one chapter of history, it cleared the stage for entirely new worlds to emerge from the ashes, setting in motion changes that would eventually give rise to classical antiquity and shape the course of human civilization for millennia. In this video, we're going to journey back to that pivotal moment, piecing together clues from archaeology, climate science, and ancient texts to unravel one of history's most compelling mysteries. We'll explore how interconnected societies navigated collapse, how human resilience flickered even in the darkest of times, and why the echoes of this ancient upheaval feel startlingly relevant today. Whether you're fascinated by the mysteries of the past or curious about the lessons history holds for our future, you're in the right place. So settle in, and let's travel back over 3,000 years to uncover the story of the Late Bronze Age collapse, a tale of endings, new beginnings, and the fragile threads that connect us all. To truly grasp the enormity of the Late Bronze Age collapse, we first need to appreciate the dazzling world that existed just before everything fell apart. This was not a period of isolated kingdoms staring suspiciously at each other across vast, empty frontiers. Instead, it was an astonishingly globalized and interconnected system, a vibrant international arena stretching from the Nile Delta to the Aegean Sea and beyond into Mesopotamia. At the heart of this world were the great powers, the fabulously wealthy New Kingdom of Egypt, a state that commanded immense resources and projected its influence far beyond its borders. To the north, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, stood the Hittite Empire, a formidable military power with a sophisticated legal code and a network of vassal states. Across the sea, the fortress palaces of the Mycenaean Greeks dominated the Peloponnese, their rulers accumulating treasures from across the known world. And to the east, the rising force of Middle Assyria was beginning to flex its muscles, adding another layer of complexity to the diplomatic chessboard. What made this era so unique was the sheer volume and sophistication of interaction between these empires. They weren't just trading simple goods, they were engaged in a complex international economy that everyone depended on. Vital raw materials flowed along well-established routes. Tin from as far away as Afghanistan was transported to mix with Cypriot copper, creating the bronze that gave the age its name. Lebanese cedar wood was shipped to Egypt for grand construction projects, while luxurious finished goods like Mycenaean pottery, Babylonian textiles, and Nubian gold circulated among the elite, signaling status and fostering a kind of shared international culture among royalty. This wasn't a haphazard exchange. It was a highly organized system with merchant enclaves in foreign ports, standardized weights and measures, and even a degree of diplomatic protection for traders. The survival and prosperity of these kingdoms were inextricably linked to the smooth functioning of these trade networks. A disruption in the supply of tin from the east could literally bring armies to a halt, while a problem in the grain supply from Egypt could trigger famine hundreds of miles away. This intricate web of connections was held together by more than just commerce. It was reinforced through advanced diplomacy. The kings of these great powers referred to each other as brother, a term denoting equality and mutual respect. They engaged in a constant stream of diplomatic correspondence, much of which has been miraculously preserved on clay tablets, like those found at Amarna in Egypt and Hattusa, the Hittite capital. These letters discuss everything from arranging royal marriages to settling border disputes, exchanging medical remedies, and even complaining about the poor quality of goods received in a recent shipment. Perhaps the most famous example of this diplomatic spirit is the Treaty of Kadesh, a peace accord signed between the Egyptians and Hittites after a stalemate battle, which stands as one of the earliest known international peace treaties. It pledged not only peace but also mutual military support against common threats and the extradition of political refugees, showing a level of political foresight and cooperation that feels remarkably modern. The cultural and technological achievements of this golden age were breathtaking. Monumental architecture was the order of the day, from the colossal temples of Karnak and Luxor in Egypt to the massive Cyclopean walls guarding Mycenaean citadels. Literacy, though reserved for a small scribble class, was widespread in administrative centers, with several writing systems in use, including Egyptian hieroglyphs, Akkadian cuneiform, and the Linear B script of the Mycenaeans. This was a world of refined artistry, skilled craftsmanship, and complex religious and social structures. It must have felt, to those living at its peak, like a permanent and unshakable order. Yet, for all its brilliance, this system possessed profound vulnerabilities. The very interconnectedness that was its greatest strength also made it critically fragile. The empires had become over-specialized and over-reliant on long, precarious supply chains. A drought in one region could ripple through the entire economic network. A wave of piracy could strangle maritime trade. Political instability in one major kingdom could topple the delicate balance of power for everyone. This glittering civilization, for all its monuments and treaties, was built on a foundation that was about to be tested in ways its architects could never have imagined. So what exactly was this event that shattered such a sophisticated world? The late Bronze Age collapse was not a single, sudden catastrophe like a volcanic eruption or a lone battle lost. Instead, it was a swift and terrifying unraveling, a systemic failure that swept across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East around the year 1200 BCE. Think of it less like a light switch being flipped off and more like a network of dominoes falling in rapid, devastating succession. Within the span of just 50 years, a mere blink in historical terms, nearly every major political and economic center from Greece to Mesopotamia was violently destroyed, abandoned, or reduced to a shadow of its former self. This wasn't a regional crisis. It was a full-blown civilizational breakdown on a scale the ancient world had never seen before and would not see again for centuries. The physical evidence for this collapse is stark and sobering. archaeologists uncovering layers from this period consistently find a telltale signature, a thick, dark band of ash and burned debris indicating widespread conflagration. The great Hittite capital of Hattusa was torched and abandoned, its mighty gates left broken. In Greece, the sprawling palace complexes of Mycenaean and Pylos went up in flames, their intricate administrative records baked into clay tablets that would never be read again. The bustling mercantile hub of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was utterly destroyed, its last desperate plea for military aid still sitting in the kiln, unsent and unfired. This wave of destruction was so comprehensive that it effectively wiped out the entire political order. Kingship, the fundamental organizing principle of the age, disappeared in many places, not to return for hundreds of years. The collapse went far deeper than just burned buildings. It was a neurological shutdown of the entire system. The intricate international trade networks that were the lifeblood of the Bronze Age world simply ceased to function. The ships carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from the east, and luxury goods from every corner stopped sailing. This economic paralysis had an immediate and catastrophic effect. Without access to tin, the production of bronze, the essential material for weapons, tools, and prestige items, ground to a halt. This technological disruption is so central to the story that it gives the entire era its name, the end of the Bronze Age. In its place, a new, more accessible metal would eventually rise, iron. But that transition was born from desperation, not innovation. One of the most poignant indicators of the collapse's depth is the dramatic decline in literacy. The complex writing systems used by palaces and scribes, Akkadian cuneiform, Linear B, and others simply vanished because the institutions that supported them were gone. The ability to read and write, once confined to a specialized class of administrators, was lost for generations across vast regions. In Greece, for example, literacy disappeared entirely for centuries, only re-emerging with the development of a completely new script, the Greek alphabet. This loss of written communication represents more than just a practical setback. It signifies a profound rupture in cultural memory and bureaucratic continuity, plunging many areas into a true dark age where history became legend and then myth. Ultimately, labeling this event a collapse can be slightly misleading if it conjures images of an instantaneous, uniform apocalypse. A more accurate description might be a systems collapse, a cascading failure where interconnected stresses, environmental, economic, military, and social, overwhelmed the resilience of these complex societies. A prolonged drought could lead to famine, which could trigger mass migrations of desperate people, who then became the feared sea peoples attacking coastal cities. Those attacks could sever vital trade routes, causing economic chaos that sparked internal rebellions against ruling elites, who were then too weak to mount an effective defense. Each crisis amplified the next, creating a feedback loop of disaster that the rigid, top-heavy Bronze Age kingdoms were utterly incapable of stopping. It was this perfect storm of interconnected crises that brought an end to a glorious era and set the stage for a darker, poorer, but ultimately new and different world to emerge from the ashes. But to truly understand how such a vast network could disintegrate, we need to move beyond the abstract concept of collapse and meet the people and powers at the heart of the drama. This was a world populated by formidable civilizations, each a titan in its own right, yet each balancing precariously on the edge of a precipice they could not see. Standing as the seemingly unshakable pillar of this age was the new kingdom of Egypt, a realm of unimaginable wealth and divine kingship. By the late 13th century BC, Egypt was under the rule of pharaohs like the great Ramesses II and later his successor, Ramesses III. Their kingdom was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, its fertile Nile Valley producing surplus grain that was a cornerstone of international trade and a crucial diplomatic tool. The Egyptian military was a professional, well-equipped force, and its administration was a sophisticated bureaucracy capable of managing a vast empire stretching from Nubia in the south to parts of the Levant in the north. To the outside world, Egypt must have appeared immortal, a golden empire blessed by the gods and destined to endure forever. Yet even this colossus was not immune to the gathering storm. Its prosperity made it a target, its long borders were difficult to defend, and its rigid, centralized system of power would soon be tested by crises that demanded unprecedented flexibility. To the north, in the rugged highlands of what is now Turkey, stood the Hittite Empire, Egypt's greatest rival and occasional ally. The Hittites were the masters of Anatolia, a hardened, militaristic culture who were among the first to master ironworking on a significant scale. Their capital, Hattusa, was a marvel of urban planning and fortification, nestled within a mountainous stronghold and protected by immense, sloping walls. The Hittites governed through a complex system of vassal treaties, binding smaller states to them with oaths of loyalty and military service. They were brilliant diplomats and pragmatic rulers, as evidenced by their peace treaty with Egypt after the epic stalemate at the Battle of Kadesh. But the Hittite Empire labored under significant burdens. Their heartland was not naturally rich in agricultural resources, making them dependent on trade and tribute from their outlying territories to feed their population. This made them particularly vulnerable to any disruption in those supply lines. Furthermore, their constant need to project military power to keep their vassals in line and defend their frontiers stretched their resources thin, leaving them with little capacity to absorb a major multi-front shock. Across the sparkling Aegean Sea, the world of the Mycenaean Greeks presented a different picture of Bronze Age power. Their society was organized around a network of fortified palace complexes, like those at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns. These were not cities in the modern sense, but heavily fortified administrative centers where a wanax or king presided over a highly centralized economy. Scribes using the Linear B script meticulously recorded every shipment of grain, every allotment of bronze, and every chariot wheel in vast archives. The Mycenaeans were skilled warriors and maritime traders, their distinctive pottery found all across the Mediterranean. However, this very centralized control was their Achilles heel. The entire system was top-heavy, reliant on the palace for everything from food distribution to craft production. If the palace was destroyed or its leadership decimated, the entire economic and social structure had no backup plan. There was no resilient, bottom-up economy to fall back on. The system was all or nothing, making it incredibly fragile in the face of a serious disruption. And then there were the crucial mercantile hubs, the cosmopolitan centers that greased the wheels of international trade. Foremost among these was the wealthy port city of Ugarit, located on the coast of modern-day Syria. Ugarit was a melting pot of cultures, a city where multiple languages were spoken, and merchants from across the known world came to do business. Its wealth was not in vast armies or sprawling territories, but in its fleet of ships and its extensive commercial networks. Similarly, the island of Cyprus, then known as Alashia, was an economic powerhouse because of its vast copper mines. This metal was an essential component of bronze, making Cyprus the equivalent of a major oil producer in today's economy. Everyone needed what it had. These kingdoms thrived on peace and stability. Their entire existence was predicated on open sea lanes and safe trade routes. They were the most connected nodes in the network, and consequently, they would be among the first to feel the effects of any systemic failure. A single piece of correspondence from the king of Ugarit perfectly captures their vulnerable position. a frantic reply to a request for troops where he explains he cannot spare any, because his own ships are all away on business and his cities are exposed to an imminent attack from the sea. These civilizations, for all their grandeur and achievement, were interconnected in ways that made their strengths also their greatest vulnerabilities. They were tied together by threads of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence, and when those threads began to snap, the entire tapestry of the Bronze Age world began to unravel. For all their diplomatic brilliance and military might, the great Bronze Age empires were ultimately at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. We often picture their downfall as a story of human conflict, invasions, rebellions, and wars, but mounting evidence points to a more profound, invisible adversary, a rapidly changing climate. Imagine the slow, creeping dread as season after season passes with only a scorching sun and a cloudless sky. The rains that were supposed to nourish the crops simply don't arrive. This wasn't a single bad year. It was a devastating climatic shift that stretched on for generations, slowly choking the life out of these sophisticated societies. Scientists today can read this ancient story of environmental stress not in scrolls or tablets, but in the most unexpected of places, the rings of ancient trees and the layers of mud at the bottom of lakes and seas. By analyzing the growth patterns in fossilized juniper trees from Turkey and studying sediment cores pulled from the seafloor near Cyprus and the Nile Delta, researchers have pieced together a startling picture of the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. The data reveals a pronounced period of prolonged and severe drought, coinciding exactly with the time frame of the collapse. This wasn't just a local dry spell. It was a regional megadrought that gripped the entire eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, ice core samples from Greenland indicate a shift towards cooler global temperatures. This combination, less rain and colder weather, would have been absolutely catastrophic for agrarian societies. Crop yields would have plummeted, harvests failing repeatedly. The fertile river valleys that supported massive populations like the Nile may have seen their life-giving floods become unpredictable or insufficient. The result was inevitable widespread famine. This environmental catastrophe acted as a trigger for a cascade of human disasters. Starving populations are desperate populations. We can envision farmers abandoning their parched fields, their families in tow, joining growing bands of displaced people moving in search of food and safety. These climate refugees would have put immense strain on the resources of any city or kingdom they approached. Borders, once permeable for traders, would have hardened. The great grain silos of Egypt, a key source of its power and a tool of its diplomacy, would have been guarded jealously for its own people, severing a critical lifeline for other states. The Hittite Empire, already reliant on importing food from Egypt and its vassal states according to diplomatic letters pleading for grain shipments, would have been brought to its knees by this failure of the very trade networks it depended on for survival. Famine weakens bodies, but it also weakens social structures, eroding loyalty to rulers who can no longer provide the most basic necessity, bread. To make an already dire situation even worse, this period of climatic instability may have been accompanied by a series of violent natural disasters. The Mediterranean region sits atop a web of active fault lines, and geological evidence suggests a possible storm of earthquakes in the late Bronze Age. These tremors could have shattered the confidence of these civilizations as thoroughly as they shattered their towering walls and palaces. A single major quake can level a city, but a cluster of them across a wide region would have overwhelmed any capacity for recovery. Furthermore, some scientists have proposed that a major volcanic eruption, possibly from Mount Hekla in Iceland or another northern volcano, could have spewed ash into the atmosphere, exacerbating the cooling trend and creating years without a summer, further crippling agriculture. Whether from seismic shocks or volcanic winters, these natural disasters would have felt like the gods themselves were turning against the established order, compounding the material destruction with a deep psychological blow. This convergence of environmental factors paints a picture of a world pushed past its breaking point. The prolonged drought was the primary stressor, the constant, grinding pressure that weakened the entire system from within. The earthquakes and potential volcanic activity were the sharp, sudden shocks that further destabilized a structure already on the verge of collapse. It's a powerful reminder that human history is not separate from natural history. The two are deeply intertwined. The fate of empires can hinge on rainfall patterns and shifting temperatures, forces that pay no heed to royal decrees or military might. The great kings of the Bronze Age, for all their grandeur, were ultimately vulnerable to the changing climate. Their magnificent civilizations brought low not just by human enemies, but by the very environment that had once nurtured their rise. This globalized Bronze Age economy was a magnificent achievement, but its complexity masked a terrifying fragility. Think of it as a magnificent, intricate mobile hanging in perfect balance, each piece dependent on the others. If you gently tugged on one string, the whole structure might sway but recover. But if you snipped a few crucial threads, the entire creation would come crashing down in a tangled heap. The most critical thread in this mobile was bronze itself, the very alloy that defined the era. Bronze is made from copper and tin, and these metals were not found together in any significant quantity. Copper was mined in places like Cyprus, which the ancients called Alashia, while the all-important tin had to travel from incredibly distant and often uncertain sources, possibly as far away as Afghanistan, Cornwall in Britain, or Central Europe. This meant that the entire military and economic power of these kingdoms relied on a supply chain that stretched thousands of miles overland and across treacherous seas. A single disruption, a war blocking a mountain pass, a drought making a desert route impassable, or pirates seizing control of a vital sea lane could strangle the supply of tin entirely. Without tin, you cannot make bronze. Without bronze, you cannot forge new weapons for your army, new tools for your farmers, or new prestige goods for your elite. The entire engine of the state would literally grind to a halt. The palaces themselves were the central nodes of this system, functioning not as simple royal homes but as the economic command centers of their entire world. In the Mycenaean kingdoms, for example, the palace at Pylos employed a small army of scribes who used the Linear B script to track astonishingly detailed inventories. Their clay tablets record every single item under the palace's control. So many chariot wheels in storage, so many kilograms of bronze allocated to a specific blacksmith, so many jars of olive oil and grain owed as tribute from outlying villages. This was a redistributive economy in its purest form. The palace collected, managed, and doled out everything. This hyper-centralization created immense efficiency and wealth in good times, but it left absolutely no room for error or flexibility. There were no independent markets to step in if the palace failed. If the central authority was weakened by famine, a plague, or an attack, the entire economic apparatus for an entire region simply ceased to exist. The people who depended on the palace for their rations were left with nothing, and the specialized craftsmen who knew how to work bronze or carve ivory found their skills suddenly useless. This vulnerability was perfectly exposed in the fortunes of the great mercantile cities. Take Ugarit, a wealthy port on the Syrian coast. Its power was not in its army but in its fleet and its role as a neutral trading hub. A library of clay tablets found in the city's ruins reveals a world of sophisticated international finance, with merchants sending letters about shipments, loans, and partnerships. Ugarit grew fabulously wealthy by being the glue that held the great powers together, but when the crisis began, that very role became its death sentence. As the threat from the so-called Sea Peoples grew, Ugarit's ships, the source of its wealth, were desperately needed for defense. But in one heartbreaking letter, the king of Ugarit replies to a plea for help from a neighboring ally. He explains that he cannot send any troops or ships because his entire fleet is currently on a commercial mission to the coast of Lebanon, and his own cities are completely exposed and vulnerable to attack. He is literally watching his destruction arrive by sea, while his primary means of defense is away on a business trip. This poignant moment captures the utter helplessness of a society whose economic logic had been instantly overturned by a new, violent reality. Their greatest asset was suddenly their greatest liability. The collapse of these trade networks did more than just cause a recession. It shattered the very foundation of political power and social order. Bronze was not just a metal, it was a symbol of authority and prestige. Kings demonstrated their right to rule by distributing bronze weapons to their loyal warriors and bronze gifts to their allied nobles. When that flow of metal stopped, the loyalty it purchased evaporated. Local chieftains who could no longer get prestige goods from the palace might turn to raiding their neighbors instead. Ambitious generals might question a king who could no longer arm his troops. The common people, already suffering from famine, would lose all faith in a ruling class that could no longer provide protection or basic necessities. The economic collapse became a political collapse, which in turn fueled a social collapse. The intricate web of interdependence that had allowed the Bronze Age to glitter so brilliantly became a catastrophic liability, ensuring that when one part of the system failed, it pulled all the others down with it. Their greatest strength, their deep connections to one another, became their ultimate Achilles heel, demonstrating a timeless lesson about the hidden risks of a globalized world. Now, emerging from the fog of this systemic breakdown comes one of history's most enduring and enigmatic puzzles, the Sea Peoples. If the collapse was a perfect storm, then these mysterious warriors were its most violent and terrifying lightning strike. We know of them primarily from the boastful inscriptions and dramatic reliefs carved on the walls of Egyptian temples, particularly those of Pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. These sources depict a chaotic alliance of different tribes, arriving in ships and on ox-drawn carts, bringing their families and all their possessions with them. They are shown in fierce naval and land battles against the Egyptians, their distinct feathered headdresses and round shields making them instantly recognizable, yet their true identity remains one of antiquity's greatest riddles. Were they a coordinated army of invaders, a ruthless confederation of pirates intent on carving out new kingdoms from the ashes of the old world? Or were they something far more tragic, a desperate wave of climate refugees, displaced by the same famine and upheaval that was crippling the great empires, now forced to migrate violently simply to survive? This question lies at the very heart of the collapse's human drama. The Egyptian records, while vivid, are frustratingly vague and entirely one-sided. They give these groups exotic and ominous names like the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Danuna, the Tjeka, and the Weshish, labeling them collectively as the peoples of the sea. Pharaoh Ramesses III claims a great victory, stating that they came with fire, ready for war, and that he smashed them like birds trapped in a net, preventing them from reaching Egypt. But these are victory monuments designed to glorify the pharaoh and assure his people of divine protection. They are not objective historical reports. They tell us nothing of where these people came from or what truly drove them. The names themselves offer tantalizing but inconclusive clues. The Peliset are almost universally agreed to be the Philistines, who later settled on the coast of Canaan. The Shekelesh might point to Sicily, the Danuna to the Danons of Greece, and the Jeka to the Teucrians of the Anatolian coast. This suggests a possible origin across the entire Aegean and Anatolian world, a broad arc of disruption that was pushing populations outward in a great, chaotic migration. This leads to the compelling refugee theory. Imagine the scenario: years of drought have devastated the farmlands of Anatolia and the Aegean. The centralized palace economies have collapsed, leaving people starving and without protection. Earthquakes have leveled cities, adding to the sense of apocalyptic doom. In this environment, entire communities would have been forced to pull up stakes. They wouldn't just be lone warriors, they would be whole populations on the move, men, women, and children packing their belongings into carts and boats, becoming what we would today call climate refugees. But in the late Bronze Age, there was no international aid, no refugee camps. A massive group of desperate, hungry people arriving at the borders of a weakened kingdom would be seen not as victims, but as an invading horde. Their migration would necessarily be violent. They would have to fight for every scrap of land, every source of food and water. They weren't professional soldiers seeking conquest. They were desperate families fighting for survival, and that made them even more dangerous. On the other hand, the invader theory cannot be entirely dismissed. The scale and coordination of their attacks, as recorded by the Egyptians, suggest a degree of organization that goes beyond mere desperate migration. They employed advanced military tactics and possessed a formidable fleet. It is possible that among these groups were seasoned mercenaries, pirates, and warriors who had once served the great empires but were now left unemployed and dangerous by the collapse. They could have coalesced into a powerful predatory force, exploiting the weakness of the established powers to raid, plunder, and carve out territory for themselves. The truth likely lies in a messy combination of both ideas. The Sea Peoples were probably a complex mixture of displaced agrarian populations, opportunistic pirates, and rogue military elements, all swept up in the same tidal wave of crisis. They were both a cause and a symptom of the collapse, a product of the very chaos they helped to accelerate. Their impact was absolutely devastating and incontrovertible, regardless of their motives. The burning layers found in the ruins of cities from Greece to the Levant often coincide with this period, and in many cases, the destruction is so complete that the sites are abandoned for centuries. The great city of Ugarit, as we saw, sent its fleet away and was left defenseless. A letter found in its ruins speaks of enemy ships already causing havoc and setting fires. The city was sacked and never reoccupied. In the aftermath, the cultural landscape was permanently altered. The Peliset, repelled from Egypt, settled on the southern coast of Canaan, giving the region the name Palestine, and eventually blending with the local Canaanite population. Other groups may have settled in Sardinia, Sicily, and elsewhere, leaving a lasting ethnic and cultural imprint on the central Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples were the ultimate symbol of the Old World's end, a terrifying, unknowable force that emerged from the disruption of the global system to deliver the final, crushing blow to civilizations that were already teetering on the brink. They represent the chaotic, unpredictable human element in a disaster driven by environmental and economic forces, a reminder that when empires fail, the power often shifts suddenly and violently to those on the outside. Yet even as empires faced invasions and environmental disasters, some of the most devastating blows came from within. A society can often withstand tremendous external pressure if it remains united, but when the very fabric of trust between rulers and the ruled begins to fray, resilience evaporates. In the late Bronze Age, beneath the glittering surface of royal palaces and international diplomacy, simmered deep-seated tensions that would prove just as fatal as any foreign army. The rigid, hierarchical structure of these kingdoms, which had once been the source of their strength, became a critical weakness under strain. At the top, the ruling elite, the kings, priests, and high-ranking officials, often lived in staggering luxury, their wealth conspicuously displayed in lavish tombs and monumental architecture. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the population, the farmers, laborers, and conscripted soldiers, bore the crushing weight of this opulence through heavy taxes, compulsory labor duties, and military service. This glaring social inequality created a powder keg of resentment, just waiting for a spark. That spark was often provided by the very rulers meant to protect their people. As crises mounted, there's evidence that corruption and short-sighted governance became rampant. In a system where the king was seen as the intermediary with the gods, a series of disasters, like persistent drought or repeated raids, could be interpreted as divine displeasure with his rule. This eroded the fundamental legitimacy of the monarchy. Local governors and regional warlords, once loyal vassals, saw the central authority weakening and began to question why they should send their precious grain, their young men for armies, and their scarce metals to a distant capital that could no longer guarantee their safety. We see hints of this in the archaeological record across the Mycenaean world, where small, hastily built fortifications appear within the larger citadels, suggesting that local factions were turning on each other, building walls not just against external enemies but against their own neighbors. The economic collapse exacerbated this internal decay in a vicious cycle. As trade routes were severed and famine set in, the palace's ability to redistribute goods, the very mechanism that sustained the social order, broke down completely. The king could no longer provide bronze to his warriors or grain to his people. In a desperate attempt to maintain control, rulers likely increased taxes and demanded even more from a population that had nothing left to give. This is a classic recipe for rebellion. Tablets from the final days of Pylos in Greece reveal a state of sheer desperation. They record the assignment of bronze smiths to coastal watchpoints and the offering of precious metal to the gods, but there is no mention of the vast fleets or armies that once served the kingdom. It paints a picture of a central administration that has lost its grip, its commands becoming increasingly frantic and irrelevant as local communities were forced to fend for themselves. This internal fragmentation made a coordinated response to the cascade of crises impossible. A kingdom fighting itself cannot also effectively fight invaders or manage a refugee crisis. When the Sea Peoples or other raiders attacked, they weren't facing a unified front but a collection of isolated, weakened, and often mutually suspicious city-states. Some communities may have even seen these outsiders as preferable to their own corrupt or ineffective rulers, choosing not to resist or even collaborating to overthrow the existing order. The grand palaces, once symbols of power and prosperity, became targets for the rage of their own starving citizens. The fire that consumed so many of these centers may not always have been set by an external enemy. In some cases, it might have been the torch of internal rebellion, a final, violent rejection of a system that had failed its people. The collapse of the late Bronze Age, therefore, was not merely a defeat inflicted from the outside. It was in many ways a social revolution, a dramatic unraveling from within that proved no empire, no matter how magnificent, is immune to the consequences of its own internal injustices. And so the collapse began to feed upon itself, a terrifying cascade where the failure of one critical node in the network dramatically increased the pressure on all the others, pulling them down one by one. This wasn't a series of separate tragedies happening in isolation. It was a classic domino effect where each falling piece made the next collapse not just possible but inevitable. The intricate interdependence that had been the Bronze Age's greatest achievement now became the very mechanism of its destruction. A perfect example of this is the fate of the Hittite Empire. When their capital Hattusa was burned and abandoned around 1200 BCE, it wasn't just the end of a powerful kingdom. The Hittites had been a crucial linchpin in the overland trade routes that brought tin, the essential ingredient for bronze, from the east into the Mediterranean. With their central authority gone, the roads they had protected and regulated fell into chaos. Bandits and raiders now controlled the mountain passes, and the safe passage of merchant caravans became impossible. Suddenly, the workshops of Egypt, Greece, and the Levant found their supply of this vital metal cut off at the source. You can almost hear the silence in the forges, the blacksmiths standing idle, the arsenals emptying. A kingdom's collapse in Anatolia meant that an army in Greece could no longer repair its weapons or outfit new recruits, making it profoundly vulnerable to its own impending crisis. This ripple effect was felt just as keenly in the realm of information. In our modern world, if the internet goes down, we have backup systems, radio, even old-fashioned telephones. The late Bronze Age had one primary system for high-level international communication: the royal couriers and merchant ships that carried clay tablet letters between the great kings. The port city of Ugarit in Syria was a central hub in this network, a place where intelligence was gathered and relayed. When Ugarit was violently destroyed, its fleet lost and its streets burned, it was the equivalent of a massive cyber attack taking down a global communications satellite system. The last desperate letters found in its ruins tell the story. One message from the Hittite king pleads for help, indicating he is under attack. Another, from the king of Ugarit himself, explains he cannot send aid because his own ships are away and his city is exposed. This vital plea was never even sent. It was baked in the kiln as the city fell. With Ugarit gone, the empires were suddenly deaf and blind to the movements of both friends and foes. A pharaoh in Egypt might have no idea that the Hittites, his sometime rivals and allies, had already fallen, leaving his northern flank completely exposed. This breakdown in communication prevented any possibility of a coordinated response, allowing the crisis to spread unchecked from one shore to the next. We can see this domino effect playing out in heartbreaking detail across the entire region. The fall of the Mycenaean palaces in Greece, for instance, had a direct impact on Egypt. The Mycenaeans were major producers of luxury goods like scented olive oil and finely painted pottery, which were highly prized by the Egyptian elite. This trade brought not just goods but also silver and other valuables into the Greek economy. When the palaces fell, that production and trade ceased. For Egypt, it was the loss of a trading partner, but for the struggling Mycenaean heartland, it was a catastrophic economic death blow. The specialized potters, perfumers, and shipbuilders lost their patrons and their market, their skills suddenly rendered worthless. This pushed more people into poverty and displacement, adding to the waves of desperate individuals who may have eventually taken to the seas as raiders or refugees, thus becoming part of the very sea people's problem that would soon hammer the Egyptian coast. The collapse of one civilization directly fueled the fire that threatened the next. This ancient lesson in systemic risk holds a stark warning for our own hyper-globalized world. We built our modern civilization on a foundation of just-in-time supply chains, international financial markets, and digital interconnectedness systems that are incredibly efficient in good times but breathtakingly fragile under stress. The late Bronze Age reminds us that when societies become so specialized and interdependent, a shock in one corner of the globe can travel at lightning speed through the entire network. A drought in one breadbasket region, a conflict in a critical shipping lane, or a financial panic in a major market can trigger a cascade of failures that no single nation can control. The fall of the Hittites and the silence of Ugarit's messengers show us that resilience often requires redundancy, local capacity, and a degree of self-sufficiency that these ancient empires, in their pursuit of maximum efficiency and wealth, had long since sacrificed. Their world did not end with a bang, but with a series of whispers falling silent, one after the other, until the only sound left was the crackling of the flames. Yet even as the old order crumbled, a remarkable and often overlooked phenomenon emerged from the chaos: the birth of desperate, unprecedented alliances. In the shadow of existential threats, the rigid diplomatic rules of the Bronze Age world began to bend and flex, revealing a capacity for cooperation that transcended generations of rivalry. The most vivid evidence for this comes from the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, where the pharaoh boasts of his great victory against the Sea Peoples. But if you look closer at the inscriptions and the accompanying reliefs, a more complex story unfolds. The text does not describe the Egyptians fighting alone. It specifically mentions a coordinated effort, a battle fought, on the waters of the great river mouth with the help of allied troops, including contingents that may have been recruited from former enemy territories or from among other displaced groups who saw a greater threat on the horizon. This suggests that the Egyptian defense was not a solitary stand but a patchwork coalition, a hastily assembled force united by a single, desperate goal: survival. This spirit of cooperation likely extended far beyond the battlefield into the fraught world of diplomacy. We have a tantalizing piece of evidence from the final, gasping days of the Hittite Empire. A letter found in the ruins of Ugarit, sent from the Hittite court, is a plea for help, but more significantly, it reveals that the Hittite king was not just writing to his own vassals. He was almost certainly in communication with his greatest rival, the pharaoh of Egypt. Decades earlier, these two superpowers had fought the epic Battle of Kadesh and later signed a famous peace treaty, which included a mutual defense clause promising to come to each other's aid against both external enemies and internal rebellions. As the Hittites faced catastrophic famine and the terrifying advance of the Sea Peoples, it is almost certain they invoked this very clause, calling upon their former enemy for shipments of grain to feed their starving people and perhaps even for military support. The fact that we have no record of Egypt sending a massive army north does not mean the request was ignored. It suggests a world where the lines of communication were still open until the very end, with old adversaries acknowledging a shared fate. These fleeting partnerships reveal a profound truth about human nature under extreme pressure. When the survival of your entire civilization is at stake, ancient grudges can suddenly seem like a luxury you can no longer afford. A local Canaanite king, who might have spent his life chafing under the tribute demands of the Egyptian or Hittite empire, would now have seen those great powers not as oppressors but as the only bulwark standing between his city and total annihilation. The enemy you know, with its organized army and fortified cities, can suddenly become a preferable partner to the unknown, chaotic force that promises only destruction. This is the calculus of desperation, and it forced a level of pragmatism that temporarily overwrote centuries of cultural and political programming. Alliances were likely formed between kingdoms that had never before exchanged anything but arrows and insults, their diplomats meeting not in lavish palace halls but in fortified camps, their negotiations driven by the ominous glow of burning cities on the horizon. However, it is crucial not to romanticize this cooperation. These were alliances of convenience, not of friendship, and they were often forged too late and with too little trust to alter the ultimate outcome. The help that was sent was probably never enough to stem the tide. The Hittites still fell. The cities of the Levant were still sacked. The cooperation that did occur was likely hampered by suspicion, logistical nightmares, and the simple, overwhelming speed of the collapse. Communication across a disintegrating landscape would have been agonizingly slow, and a promise of aid might arrive in a city that had already been reduced to ashes. Yet, the mere existence of these efforts is what matters. In the face of an apocalypse, the great kingdoms of the Bronze Age did not simply turn inward and accept their doom. They reached out, they tried to coordinate, they honored old treaties in a world that was falling apart around them. This fragile, last-ditch unity offers a powerful glimpse of resilience, a testament to the enduring human instinct to seek allies and build walls against the darkness, even when those walls are already crumbling. The silent stones and buried layers of ancient cities offer the most chilling testimony to the scale of the collapse, speaking a language of fire and violence that transcends the centuries. Archaeology allows us to walk through these ruined gates and stand in the ashes of the final days, transforming the abstract concept of a collapse into a tangible, heartbreaking reality. Nowhere is this more visceral than at Hattusa, the magnificent capital of the Hittite Empire. This was no minor outpost. It was a sprawling, fortified metropolis nestled in the Anatolian highlands, a testament to imperial power with its massive, sloping walls and grand royal citadel. Walking through the Lion Gate today, you can still feel the weight of its history, but then you see the evidence, a distinct, blackened destruction layer found across the entire site, marking a conflagration so intense it vitrified mud brick and shattered stone. The city was not just attacked, it was systematically put to the torch. What makes Hattusa's fall so telling is that it was never rebuilt as a major center. The Hittite heartland was simply abandoned, its people scattered, its political power extinguished forever. This wasn't a temporary setback, it was a permanent erasure of an empire from the stage of history. Across the Aegean Sea, a similar story of violent and final endings was unfolding. The great palatial centers of the Mycenaean world, like Mycenae itself with its iconic Lion Gate and Pylos with its elaborate archives, met a fiery demise. At these sites, archaeologists have uncovered a familiar signature, a thick, concentrated layer of ash and burned debris sealing the final late Bronze Age occupation. At Pylos, the Linear B tablets, which meticulously recorded the palace's final desperate allocations of bronze to watchmen and offerings to the gods, were baked hard in the very fire that destroyed the building that housed them, preserving their last words for over 3 millennia. The destruction was so complete and the collapse of the administrative system so total that the art of writing itself vanished from Greece for hundreds of years. These were not cities that were damaged and then repaired. They were centers of power whose very concept of governance was annihilated in the blaze. The population didn't vanish, they likely retreated to smaller, more defensible, and simpler settlements in the hills. But the complex, centralized world of the Wanax, the palace, and the scribe was gone, never to return in the same form. Perhaps the most poignant archaeological time capsule from the entire period is the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. Ugarit was the epitome of a wealthy, cosmopolitan trading hub, a city that had thrived on peace and international connection. Its ruins tell a story of a catastrophic and sudden end. The wealth of its citizens is evident in the finds ivory carvings, gold jewelry, and libraries of clay tablets detailing its vast commercial networks. But so is the violence of its destruction. The city shows clear signs of a coordinated attack, with intense fires that collapsed buildings, trapping their occupants. The most haunting finds, however, are not the valuables left behind but the mundane objects that speak to a city caught completely off guard. In one house, the bodies of a family were found huddled together in the basement, overcome by smoke and fire as they tried to hide from the onslaught. Even more dramatic are the last written words of the kingdom. A tablet found in the oven of a scribe's house, waiting to be fired and sent, contains a desperate reply from the king of Ugarit to a plea for help from a neighboring king. He writes that he cannot send troops because his own army and ships are already committed elsewhere and his city is exposed, adding the heartbreaking line, "My father, now the enemy's ships are already here. They have set fire to my cities and have done great damage." This letter, never sent, captures the precise moment the world ended for Ugarit, a stark reminder that this collapse happened to real people in real time. Beyond the dramatic evidence of fire, the archaeological record reveals subtler but equally telling clues about the causes and nature of the collapse. At many sites, hordes of buried valuables have been found, carefully hidden caches of bronze weapons, jewelry, and precious metals that were never recovered by their owners. This suggests a population living in fear, hiding their wealth from an imminent threat they knew was coming, a threat that ultimately did arrive and prevented them from ever returning to reclaim their treasures. We also see evidence of frantic last-minute preparations. At some sites, the monumental architecture of the previous era is crudely reinforced with hastily built, weaker walls, indicating a desperate attempt to shore up defenses with limited time and resources. Furthermore, paleobotanical analysis of seeds and food remains from the final layers of these cities often shows a decline in the quality and variety of diet, pointing to famine and scarcity in the years leading up to the final destruction. This physical evidence paints a multi-layered picture of a society under immense and compounding stress, not just from a single invading army, but from a prolonged period of hunger, fear, and social breakdown that left them vulnerable to a final, devastating blow. The archaeology doesn't give us a simple answer, but it provides the brutal, physical facts from which we can begin to reconstruct the terrifying complexity of the end. Imagine the profound silence that fell over the Mediterranean world in the wake of the collapse, not just a silence of abandoned cities, but a silence of the mind. The most devastating loss was the very ability to record and transmit complex thought. In the Mycenaean world, the linear B script, used by palace scribes to meticulously track everything from chariot wheels to offerings for the gods, vanished completely. The knowledge of how to form those intricate symbols on clay tablets was extinguished, not to be rediscovered for over 400 years. This was not an isolated phenomenon. Across the region, literacy, once the exclusive tool of a sophisticated administrative class, went into a steep decline. The great diplomatic correspondence in Akkadian cuneiform that had once connected the courts of Egypt, Hatti, and Babylon fell silent. Without scribes to maintain them, the vast bureaucratic systems that managed tax collection, food distribution, and legal decrees simply ceased to function. This loss of the written word meant more than just an end to record keeping. It severed the cultural and historical continuity of these civilizations. Laws, epic poems, religious rituals, and royal lineages that had been carefully preserved for generations were now vulnerable, surviving only through fragile oral tradition, where they could be altered, simplified, or forgotten with each passing generation. This cultural amnesia was mirrored in the physical landscape by a dramatic decline in artistic and architectural ambition. The era of monumental construction, of building on a scale meant to echo through the ages, came to an abrupt halt. The skills required to quarry, transport, and erect massive stone blocks for towering temples and fortified citadels were largely lost. In Greece, the great Tholos tombs and cyclopean walls of the Mycenaean citadels were not repaired or replaced. they stood as crumbling, haunted reminders of a grander past. Artistic expression, once characterized by naturalistic detail and international influences seen in vibrant frescoes and intricate goldwork, became markedly simpler and more geometric. Pottery, one of the most common artifacts archaeologists uncover, tells a clear story of this decline. The beautifully painted, complex designs of late Bronze Age vessels gave way to simpler, more utilitarian pots with basic, abstract patterns. This shift wasn't necessarily a loss of talent, but a reflection of a new reality. Without wealthy royal patrons to commission elaborate artworks, and without the international exchange of ideas that spurred innovation, artistry turned inward and local, focusing on practical needs rather than grand displays of power and prestige. The economic engine of the Bronze Age long-distance trade sputtered and almost died. The safe sea lanes and protected overland routes that had allowed copper from Cyprus, tin from the east, and luxury goods from every corner to circulate freely were now the domain of pirates and raiders. The specialized international merchant class that had operated out of hubs like Ugarit disappeared. This led to a profound technological regression. The most telling example is bronze itself. Without access to the distant tin mines, the production of new bronze became nearly impossible. Societies were forced to make do with what they had, recycling existing metal repeatedly. This scarcity became the unlikely mother of a crucial invention, the widespread adoption of ironworking. Iron ore was far more common and accessible than tin, but the process of smelting and forging iron required significantly higher temperatures and different techniques than bronze. The collapse forced experimentation and innovation out of sheer necessity. While early iron was often inferior to well-crafted bronze, the technology gradually improved. This shift from a reliance on scarce, imported bronze to more readily available iron was a revolutionary change that would eventually democratize metal tools and weapons, making them accessible to a much broader segment of the population in the centuries to come. We must be careful, however, not to view this period solely through the lens of loss. The term Dark Age, while useful, can be misleading if it implies a complete and uniform blankness. This was a time of fragmentation and simplification, but also of incubation and local adaptation. With the collapse of the oppressive, top-heavy palace economies, power decentralized. People moved to smaller, more defensible hilltop settlements. Life became more local, more focused on the immediate community and its survival. In this crucible, old social hierarchies were broken down. The rigid class structure that separated the Wanaks from the lowliest laborer softened. This created a social vacuum that would eventually be filled by new forms of organization. The seeds of the classical Greek polis, or city-state, with its broader base of citizen participation, were sown in this period of decentralization. The loss of a single, overwhelming cultural force like the Mycenaean or Hittite empires allowed for the development of distinct regional identities. The Proto-Greek tribes, the Phoenician city-states, the Israelite Confederation, that would define the next chapter of history. The darkness was not absolute. It was the necessary night that allowed new stars to slowly appear, setting the stage for a world that would be fundamentally different and in some ways more dynamic than the one it replaced. Yet amidst the overwhelming narrative of collapse and disintegration, a crucial and often overlooked chapter of this story is one of survival and remarkable adaptation. The darkness was not absolute, and the end was not the same for everyone. While empires like the Hittites and Mycenaeans vanished into history, other societies demonstrated an incredible capacity for resilience, finding ways to endure the storm, often by transforming themselves completely. Think of it not as a single, uniform apocalypse, but as a brutal filtering process, a test of societal flexibility that some managed to pass, albeit in a radically altered form. The mighty new kingdom of Egypt provides a powerful case study in managed decline. Under the determined leadership of Pharaoh Ramesses III, Egypt successfully repelled the major assaults of the Sea Peoples in both a legendary land and sea battle, an event he immortalized on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. This victory, however, came at an enormous cost. The Egyptian state was bled dry by the effort, its treasuries emptied, and its grip on its foreign possessions in the Levant loosened forever. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses III ruled over a much diminished realm. They retreated inward, focusing on preserving the core of their civilization in the Nile Valley, while largely abandoning their imperial ambitions. The government became more decentralized, with power shifting to powerful high priests of Ammon in Thebes and local governors. Egypt survived, but it was a shadow of its former Bronze Age glory, entering a long period of economic contraction and political fragmentation that would eventually leave it vulnerable to foreign domination. It was a classic example of a civilization battening down the hatches, sacrificing its expansive power in order to preserve its essential cultural heart. To the east, the Assyrians demonstrated a different kind of resilience. Unlike the coastal powers hammered by the Sea Peoples, the Assyrian heartland was nestled further inland in Upper Mesopotamia, somewhat buffered from the immediate chaos of the Mediterranean coastline. While they certainly faced their own pressures, including drought and attacks from neighboring mountain tribes, the Assyrian state apparatus proved incredibly durable. They managed to hold on to their core territory around the cities of Ashur and Nineveh. This period of crisis actually allowed them a crucial breathing space. While the other great empires were collapsing, Assyria was conserving its strength, biding its time. The power vacuum created by the fall of the Hittites to their west and the decline of Babylon to their south would later present them with a tremendous opportunity for expansion. In the coming centuries, freed from the constraints of the old Bronze Age balance of power, Assyria would explode out of its heartland to build the fearsome Neo-Assyrian Empire, the first true Iron Age military machine. Their survival through the collapse positioned them to become the dominant power of the next era. Perhaps the most fascinating stories of adaptation come not from the great powers that held on, but from the smaller, more agile societies that found opportunity in the chaos. The Phoenician city-states such as Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, located on the coast of modern-day Lebanon, are a perfect example. These cities had long been part of the Egyptian and Hittite spheres of influence, thriving as vassal states within the international trade network. When that network disintegrated and their overlords could no longer protect them, they were forced to adapt or perish. They chose to adapt brilliantly. Leveraging their legendary maritime skills and their coveted resources like the famous cedar wood, the Phoenicians took to the seas not as raiders, but as the new master traders of the Mediterranean. With no great empires to dictate terms or control routes, they established their own independent trading posts and colonies across the sea, from Cyprus to Sardinia, and eventually as far as North Africa and Spain. They simplified the complex cuneiform script to create a revolutionary 22-letter alphabet, making literacy more accessible and streamlining commercial record-keeping. This innovation would eventually spread to the Greeks and form the basis of our own alphabet. The Phoenicians didn't just survive the collapse, they used it as a launching pad for a new, decentralized, and highly successful model of commercial civilization that would shape the entire Mediterranean for centuries. Similarly, on the island of Cyprus, known then as Alashia, society underwent a profound transformation. The island had been a critical economic player because of its rich copper mines, but its centralized palace administration, similar to the Mycenaean model, collapsed. In its place, new, smaller coastal city-states like Kishan and Paphos emerged. These new polities continued to work the copper mines but adapted to the new, more dangerous world by becoming more defensible and focusing their trade on a regional rather than an international scale. They became crucial way stations for the new maritime networks being pioneered by the Phoenicians and others. The story of these survivors, whether it's Egypt hunkering down, Assyria waiting in the wings, or the Phoenicians and Cypriots innovating their way to a new future, teaches us that resilience is not always about resisting change. Often, it is about flexibility, the willingness to let go of old forms and embrace new, sometimes smaller-scale ways of organizing society. They show that even in the most devastating collapse, human ingenuity finds a path forward, laying the groundwork for the world that is to come. In the face of such overwhelming and multifaceted crises, the quality of leadership became the critical factor that separated those who would endure from those who would be swept into oblivion. A king or pharaoh was no longer merely a figure of ceremonial power or a distant divine representative. They were now a crisis manager, a war leader, and the ultimate decision maker upon whose judgment the fate of their entire civilization could hinge. The monumental inscriptions and temple reliefs they left behind offer a powerful, if one-sided, window into their efforts, revealing a stark contrast in both capability and effectiveness. The most celebrated example is undoubtedly Pharaoh Ramesses III of Egypt's 20th dynasty, who reigned during the very peak of the invasions. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu stands as a massive stone archive of his response, its walls covered in detailed reliefs and hieroglyphic texts describing great battles on both land and sea against the amorphous confederation known as the Sea Peoples. Ramesses did not merely stand on the defensive. His inscriptions speak of carefully laid plans, of recruiting foreign mercenaries to bolster his own troops, of building a specialized fleet and luring the enemy's ships into the protected waterways of the Nile Delta where they could be ambushed and destroyed. This was not a panicked reaction but a calculated, strategic defense that leveraged Egypt's geographical advantages and its remaining wealth to organize a coordinated counterattack. His famous declaration, "I prepared my frontier in the north, and I caused the infantry and the chariotry to stand firm," speaks to a leader who understood the necessity of projecting strength and confidence, even in the most dire circumstances. His successful defense, however costly, allowed Egypt to survive as a coherent state, proving that decisive and organized leadership could indeed act as a bulwark against the tide of chaos. Yet for every story of effective leadership, there are likely untold stories of failure, hesitation, or misjudgment that contributed to the downfall of other kingdoms. The last king of Ugarit, for instance, known to us from his frantic correspondence as Amurapi, presents a tragically different picture. His letters, discovered in the ruins of his burned palace, reveal a ruler overwhelmed by events, trapped in a web of obligations he could not meet. When his superior, the Hittite king, pleaded for assistance, Amurapi's reply was one of utter desperation. He explained that all his troops and ships were already deployed elsewhere, his city was defenseless, and the enemy was already at his gates. Whether this was a result of poor planning, a tragic miscalculation of the threat, or simply being caught in an impossible situation with no good options, the outcome was the same. His city was sacked and burned, never to be reoccupied. His leadership in that final, critical moment was defined by an inability to marshal an effective response, a failure that sealed the fate of his people. We can imagine similar scenarios playing out in the palaces of the Mycenaean Wanaks, where the highly centralized system meant that if the king and his small administrative elite were killed or discredited, the entire societal structure had no backup plan, no secondary layer of command to organize a resistance. In these cases, a lack of flexible, adaptable leadership turned a crisis into a catastrophe. The stark difference in outcomes underscores a profound truth about governance during a collapse. The most resilient systems were not necessarily the richest or most powerful, but those that could adapt their traditional structures to meet an unprecedented threat. The Assyrian kings, for example, demonstrated a different kind of effective leadership through ruthless consolidation. Rather than stretching their resources to defend a far-flung empire or engage in grandiose projects, they appear to have retrenched, focusing their remaining power on protecting their Assyrian heartland around the cities of Ashur and Nineveh. This strategic contraction was not a sign of weakness but of pragmatic intelligence. By battening down the hatches and surviving the worst of the storm, they preserved the core of their military and administrative apparatus. This conservative, defensive strategy allowed them to emerge from the so-called Dark Age not as a weakened remnant, but as a potent and unified power poised for the explosive expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Their leaders understood that survival sometimes requires sacrificing imperial glory to ensure national existence. Ultimately, the legacy of Bronze Age leadership during the collapse is a lesson in the duality of power. A strong, centralized authority could be a tremendous asset, enabling the rapid mobilization of resources and men, as seen in Egypt. But that same rigidity could also be a fatal liability if it could not respond to unexpected challenges with innovation and flexibility. The kings who failed were often those who tried to apply the old rules of diplomacy, warfare, and economics to a new world where those rules no longer applied. The most successful leaders, whether through brilliant strategy like Ramesses or through pragmatic retrenchment like the Assyrians, were those who recognized the unprecedented nature of the crisis and were willing to adapt their tactics, their alliances, and even their very understanding of kingship to meet it. They proved that in times of existential threat, the most important resource a civilization possesses is not grain or bronze, but wise and decisive judgment at the very top. This story from over 3,000 years ago may feel distant, but its echoes are startlingly relevant to the world we live in today. We often view our modern globalized civilization as uniquely advanced and resilient, yet the collapse of the Bronze Age world holds up a mirror, revealing vulnerabilities that are deeply familiar. The most striking parallel lies in our shared dependence on a fragile web of international supply chains. For the ancient world, it was the flow of tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus that was absolutely vital. The entire economic and military apparatus of every major power relied on these materials moving across thousands of miles of land and sea. Today, our complex networks deliver everything from semiconductors and pharmaceuticals to rare earth minerals and energy resources. A disruption in one critical node, a pandemic shutting down ports, a conflict closing a major shipping lane, or a natural disaster halting production in a key industrial region can send shockwaves through the entire global economy, causing shortages, inflation, and social unrest. Just as the kings of Ugarit and Hattusa discovered, our greatest strength, deep economic interdependence, can rapidly become our greatest weakness when that system is stressed. Perhaps the most chilling lesson comes from the role of climate change. For decades, the collapse was explained primarily by invasions and wars, a narrative of human conflict. But modern scientific detective work, analyzing ancient tree rings, sediment cores, and ice samples has uncovered the true underlying stressor: a prolonged period of severe drought and cooling temperatures that stretched on for generations. This environmental shift crippled agriculture, led to widespread famine, and created waves of desperate climate refugees. The parallels to our current planetary crisis are impossible to ignore. We too face the escalating consequences of a changing climate, more frequent and intense droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, and rising sea levels that threaten coastal cities and agricultural heartlands. These events strain resources, displace populations, and increase the potential for conflict over dwindling essentials like water and fertile land. The Late Bronze Age reminds us that environmental stress is not a standalone issue. It is a threat multiplier that can amplify social, economic, and political tensions to a breaking point, destabilizing societies that appear powerful on the surface. This ancient crisis also serves as a powerful case study in the failure of complex, rigid systems. The Bronze Age palaces, with their hyper-centralized redistributive economies, were marvels of efficiency but had no backup plans. When the center failed, everything collapsed with it. Our modern world is built on similar systems of immense complexity, centralized power grids, global financial networks, and digital infrastructure. These systems offer incredible efficiency but can lack redundancy and resilience. A cyber attack on a financial hub, an electromagnetic pulse, or a coordinated attack on undersea internet cables could potentially trigger cascading failures that are difficult to predict and even harder to stop. The lesson here is not to abandon complexity, but to consciously build in buffers, redundancies, and local capacities. It encourages a shift in thinking from pure efficiency towards a greater emphasis on resilience, the ability to withstand shocks, adapt, and keep functioning even when parts of the system fail. Finally, the collapse speaks to the eternal challenge of international cooperation in the face of a common threat. The final days of the Bronze Age show glimpses of former enemies, the Egyptians and Hittites attempting to coordinate and honor old mutual defense treaties, even as their world burned around them. Their efforts were likely too little, too late, hampered by slow communication and deep-seated distrust. Our world today faces its own set of transnational threats, from pandemics and climate change to nuclear proliferation and terrorism. Addressing these challenges requires a level of global cooperation and trust that often seems elusive, as national interests frequently override collective action. The ancient world's experience is a sobering reminder that civilizational scale problems cannot be solved by any one nation acting alone. It underscores the urgent need to strengthen international institutions, build diplomatic bridges, and find ways to foster cooperation over conflict. The ashes of Hattusa and Ugarit are a monument to what can happen when civilizations fail to unite against a common danger, a warning from the past that urges us to find a better path forward. Given the sheer scale and complexity of the Late Bronze Age collapse, it's no surprise that historians and archaeologists don't all agree on a single, neat explanation. Instead, the field is alive with a vibrant and ongoing debate, a kind of intellectual detective story where each scholar brings their own piece of evidence to the table, arguing for its prime importance. This isn't a sign of confusion. It's a sign of healthy, rigorous inquiry into an event that was, by its very nature, multifaceted. The most compelling way to understand this ancient catastrophe isn't to choose one single cause, but to see how these different theories interact, how they layer upon one another to create a perfect storm. The debate itself reveals the true complexity of history, showing us that the fall of civilizations is rarely about just one thing going wrong. One of the most prominent and persuasive schools of thought is the environmental argument, which has gained tremendous traction with the help of modern science. Proponents of this view, armed with data from tree ring analysis and lake sediment cores, point to that prolonged, regional megadrought as the fundamental trigger. They argue that no matter how sophisticated a society's army or bureaucracy, it cannot withstand years of crop failure and famine. This theory frames the Sea Peoples not as a mysterious external invading force, but as a symptom of this deeper problem: climate, refugees displaced from their homelands by hunger, forced to migrate and inevitably coming into violent conflict with established kingdoms in their search for new land and resources. In this interpretation, the changing climate was the spark that lit the fuse, creating the conditions for all the other disasters that followed. It's a powerful reminder that human history is inextricably linked to the natural world, and that the mightiest empires are ultimately vulnerable to shifts in the weather. On the other side of the debate are scholars who give greater weight to human agency and conflict, often called the systemic collapse or internal failure model. From this perspective, the environmental stresses were real, but they merely exposed the profound weaknesses already baked into the late Bronze Age system. These historians point to the extreme centralization of the palace economies, the glaring social inequalities, and the fragility of those long-distance trade networks. They argue that these societies were like magnificent but top-heavy structures. When the foundation was shaken by drought or earthquakes, the entire edifice came crashing down because of its own internal design flaws. In this view, the invasions of the Sea Peoples were a consequence of the collapse, not its cause: opportunistic raids on kingdoms that were already buckling under their own weight from internal rebellion, corruption, and economic paralysis. This theory suggests that a more resilient, less centralized social structure might have weathered the environmental pressures, but the rigid, hierarchical kingdoms of the Bronze Age were uniquely ill-equipped to adapt. Then there are the pluralists who argue that trying to identify a single primary cause is ultimately a futile exercise. For them, the collapse was the result of a catastrophic convergence, where multiple stresses, environmental, economic, military, and social, reached a critical tipping point at the same time. A prolonged drought weakens a kingdom through famine, which leads to internal unrest and rebellion. This internal disarray makes it easy prey for external raiders, whose attacks then sever vital trade routes. The collapse of trade cripples the economy and the military, leading to more widespread chaos and further migration. Each crisis amplifies the next in a vicious feedback loop that the complex, interdependent system simply could not withstand. This view doesn't see the debates as contradictory but as complementary. Each theory explains one crucial thread in a much larger, tangled rope. It acknowledges that history is messy, and that sometimes the most accurate answer is also the most complex. Everything went wrong at once. What makes this debate so valuable is that it is constantly evolving, fueled by new discoveries that can suddenly tilt the scales of interpretation. A new archaeological find, like a shipwreck from the period carrying a unique cargo, or a fresh scientific analysis of ancient pollen grains, can offer a crucial new piece of the puzzle. This is why the story of the late Bronze Age collapse is never truly finished. It is a narrative that is continually being refined and rewritten. Engaging with these competing theories does more than just help us understand the past. It teaches us a valuable lesson about historical thinking itself. It shows us that history is not a set of fixed facts but a dynamic process of interpretation. A conversation across time where new evidence can always challenge old assumptions and open up exciting new possibilities for understanding the human story. Out of the ashes and silence left by the collapse, a new world slowly and painfully began to take shape. This was not a swift rebirth but a long, gradual awakening, a period of fragmentation and simplification that historians would later call the Iron Age. The name itself points to the most profound technological shift that emerged from the crisis. With the intricate Bronze Age trade networks in ruins, the supply of tin, that crucial ingredient for bronze, vanished entirely. Societies could no longer produce the metal that had defined an era, forcing them to innovate out of sheer necessity. They turned to a far more common and accessible material, iron. While early iron was often softer and more brittle than well-crafted bronze, the technology rapidly improved. Iron smelting required higher temperatures and different techniques, but it didn't rely on fragile international supply chains. Iron ore could be found almost everywhere, from riverbeds to bogs, making it a democratizing metal. Soon, not just kings and elite warriors, but common farmers could afford an iron plowshare to till tougher soil or an iron axe to clear forestland. This technological revolution didn't just change warfare, it changed daily life and agriculture, allowing communities to become more self-sufficient and less dependent on the centralized systems that had so catastrophically failed them. This decentralization of technology was mirrored by a radical decentralization of power. The grand, top-down palace economies were gone, replaced by smaller, more flexible political units. In Greece, the void left by the fallen Mycenaean Wanacs was gradually filled by the rise of the polis, the independent city-state. These were communities built on a smaller scale, often governed by councils of local aristocrats or, eventually, by broader assemblies of citizens. The values of this new world were different, emphasizing local identity, civic participation, and legal codes that applied to more than just the common people. A similar process unfolded in the Levant, where small, tribal confederations evolved into fledgling kingdoms. The Israelites, for example, emerged from the highlands of Canaan, their identity coalescing around a new form of monotheistic faith that stood in stark contrast to the imperial, polytheistic religions of the collapsed empires. Their story, preserved in the Hebrew Bible, is deeply intertwined with the aftermath of the collapse, reflecting a search for order and meaning in a world turned upside down. No society better exemplifies the opportunistic spirit of this new age than the Phoenicians. Once vassals to the Hittites and Egyptians in their coastal cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, they found themselves suddenly free of imperial oversight when their overlords fell. Instead of succumbing to the chaos, they leveraged their legendary seafaring skills to become the master traders and colonists of the Mediterranean. Without great empires controlling the seas, they established a vast, decentralized network of trading posts from Cyprus to Sardinia, and eventually as far as North Africa, where they founded the city of Carthage. Their most lasting innovation, however, was born from the collapse of the old writing systems. Sometime in the wake of the turmoil, they simplified the complex cuneiform script into a revolutionary phonetic alphabet of just 22 letters. This was no longer a tool reserved for a tiny class of palace scribes. It was a practical system for merchants to keep records and for communities to preserve their stories. This brilliant adaptation would eventually be adopted and modified by the Greeks, becoming the very ancestor of the alphabet you are reading now. The Phoenicians didn't just survive the collapse, they thrived by building a new kind of power based on commerce, mobility, and accessible knowledge rather than land armies and imperial tribute. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was in many ways poorer, smaller, and less connected than the one that had been lost. The glorious art, monumental architecture, and international diplomacy of the previous era were gone. But in their place was something arguably more dynamic and resilient. The new political units were harder to topple than the great empires. If one city-state fell, others remained. The new technologies were more accessible, and the new ideas, from Greek concepts of citizenship to Israelite monotheism, were more portable and spread more easily. The Iron Age was a world of experimentation, where many different models of society could be tested. This period of fragmentation and struggle, as difficult and dark as it was, ultimately cleared the ground for the next great flowering of human civilization. It set the stage for the philosophical and political revolutions of classical Greece, the expansion of the Roman Republic, and the enduring cultural and religious traditions that would shape Western civilization. The collapse was an ending of unimaginable magnitude, but it was also a necessary clearing, a brutal but effective reset that made room for the seeds of the world we know today. When civilizations experience a trauma as profound as the collapse of the Bronze Age, the event doesn't just vanish from history, it seeps into the very soul of a culture, transforming from a historical fact into a powerful myth. These stories become the vessels through which generations process collective loss, explain a fallen world they can scarcely remember, and forge a new identity from the ashes of the old. The great epic poems and foundational religious texts that emerged in the centuries following the collapse are not merely works of imagination. They are deeply encoded memories, a haunting echo of a real cataclysm retold through the lens of gods, heroes, and divine judgment. The most famous of these echoes is undoubtedly Homer's Iliad, with its tale of a great coalition of Greek kings laying siege to the mighty city of Troy. While the war likely reflects a real conflict from the late Bronze Age, the epic as we know it was composed centuries later, during the Greek Dark Age. In this retelling, the story is no longer about trade routes or political rivalries. It becomes a timeless saga of pride, rage, and the tragic cost of war. The ruined citadels that the Iron Age Greeks saw dotting their landscape, the massive cyclopean walls of Mycenae and Turin, were no longer just abandoned palaces. To them, they were the proof of a heroic age, the literal remains of the world Agamemnon and Achilles once walked. The Iliad served as a bridge connecting a diminished, fragmented present to a glorified, powerful past, giving a people living in simpler times a grand and heroic origin story. This process of myth-making is even more profound in the narratives of the Hebrew Bible, which began to take shape during the same post-collapse period. The stories of the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the rise of Israelite kings can be read as a powerful response to the geopolitical vacuum left by the fallen empires. With the Hittites gone and Egypt in retreat, new groups, including the early Israelites, were able to move into the central highlands of Canaan and establish their own communities. Their foundational myth of escaping oppression in a mighty empire, wandering in the wilderness, and conquering a land of milk and honey provided a divine justification for their presence and a unifying identity that set them apart from their neighbors. The collapse of the established order allowed for the rise of new religious ideas, most significantly a shift towards monotheism, which rejected the pantheon of gods worshipped by the failed Bronze Age superpowers. This was a theological revolution born from the rubble, a declaration that the old gods of Egypt and Canaan had proven powerless, and that a new covenant with a single, all-powerful deity was needed. Perhaps the most universal myth to emerge from this era, appearing in countless cultures across the region, is the story of a great civilization-ending flood. From the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical account of Noah, these tales share astonishing similarities. A divine decision to wipe out humanity, a righteous man chosen to build a boat, the saving of animal species, and the eventual receding of the waters to reveal a washed, clean world. While a global flood is not supported by evidence, scholars suggest these stories could be a collective memory of a period of catastrophic environmental chaos, the very same prolonged droughts, followed by devastating flash floods and tsunamis that the geological record reveals for the collapse period. For agrarian societies, a failure of the rains was as existential a threat as a flood. a generation that lived through years of crop failure, famine, and the terrifying sight of the sea violently reclaiming coastal cities, might very well explain such suffering as a divine deluge, a punishment from the gods that only a few survived. These flood myths served as the ultimate cautionary tale about the fragility of human ambition and the wrath of nature, lessons seared into cultural memory by the very real traumas of the 12th century BC. These stories were far more than simple entertainment or religious doctrine. They were essential tools for survival. In a world without written histories, they became the primary mechanism for transmitting crucial lessons across generations. A tale about a proud king whose hubris leads to his city's destruction wasn't just a good story. It was a warning against the dangers of centralized power and overreach, a direct lesson learned from the collapse of the top-heavy palace economies. Legends of wandering heroes struggling to find their way home, like Odysseus, reflected the reality of a world where familiar landmarks and political centers had vanished, where journeys were fraught with peril and identity was constantly in question. By embedding these traumatic events into the realm of myth, these cultures could process the unimaginable. They could assign meaning to the chaos, attribute the disaster to a known cause like divine displeasure, and ultimately create a narrative of resilience and renewal. The flood recedes, the hero returns home, and the promised land is reached. This narrative arc provided hope and a sense of purpose, ensuring that the end of their world was not truly the end, but rather the difficult and necessary beginning of a new chapter in the human story. Just a few decades ago, our understanding of the late Bronze Age collapse was largely confined to the accounts written by the survivors and the silent, charred ruins they left behind. We were piecing together a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, but today we are living in a golden age of discovery where advanced scientific techniques are acting like a powerful torch, illuminating dark corners of this ancient mystery and forcing us to completely rethink what we thought we knew. This isn't just about finding new artifacts anymore. It's about reading the stories hidden within the artifacts we already have, extracting data from the most unexpected sources, from ancient tooth enamel to deep sea mud, and the very DNA of the people who lived through the chaos. One of the most dramatic breakthroughs comes from the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. In the 1980s, a sponge diver off the coast of Turkey stumbled upon a breathtaking sight: the scattered remains of a ship that sank around 1300 BC, a time when the great empires were still at their peak. This became known as the Uluburan shipwreck, and it is a time capsule from the height of Bronze Age globalization. The cargo was staggering in its diversity: 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, a ton of precious tin, ebony from Africa, ivory tusks, glass ingots from Mesopotamia, and exquisite pottery from Mycenaean Greece and Canaan. This single vessel, likely heading towards the Aegean, is physical proof of the incredible complexity and reach of those international trade networks. It makes their subsequent collapse even more profound. We aren't just reading about this economy in letters anymore, we are touching it. More recent underwater discoveries, like a wreck found off the Israeli coast with a cargo of tin and other metals, confirm that this trade was still active right up to the moment of collapse, making the sudden silence that followed all the more deafening. On land, we are no longer just excavating buildings. We are excavating the very bodies of the people who lived in them. Isotopic analysis is a revolutionary technique that allows scientists to read a person's life story from their skeletal remains. By studying the chemical signatures locked inside ancient teeth and bones, researchers can determine where a person was born and where they moved throughout their life. This science is completely transforming the debate around the enigmatic sea peoples. For generations, we could only guess at their origins based on their names in Egyptian texts. Now we have direct evidence, Studies of remains from burial sites in Israel dating to the period after the collapse show that some individuals spent their childhoods not in the Levant, but far away, possibly in parts of Anatolia or the Aegean. This doesn't necessarily mean they were invaders. It provides hard data that people were indeed migrating over long distances during this turbulent period, bringing their families and cultures with them, confirming the massive displacement that the climate data suggests. Perhaps the most conclusive evidence has come from the field of paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates. The long-held theory of a climate-induced collapse has moved from speculation to near certainty thanks to incredibly precise data. By analyzing the growth rings in ancient, preserved juniper trees from Turkey and sediment cores drilled from the seafloor near Cyprus and the Nile Delta, scientists have constructed a year-by-year timeline of environmental conditions. The results are unequivocal. The eastern Mediterranean was hit by a severe and prolonged drought that lasted for up to 200 years, spanning the exact time frame of the collapse. Tree rings show stunted growth, and seafloor sediments reveal a decrease in the runoff from rivers that would have been flowing during wetter periods. This wasn't just a few bad harvests. It was a civilization-altering mega-drought that would have led to famine, price inflation, and mass migrations on an unimaginable scale, placing unbearable stress on the interconnected kingdoms. Even space-age technology is now contributing to the story. Satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar are allowing archaeologists to see beneath the Earth's surface without ever lifting a shovel. These tools have revealed vast, unknown networks of roads, settlements, and fortifications from the Bronze Age, showing us that these societies were even more complex and extensive than we previously believed. This technology is also helping to map the widespread evidence of earthquakes. By examining the way walls have fallen and layers of sediment have been disturbed at multiple sites, geologists are identifying a possible earthquake storm, a cluster of major seismic events that may have rattled the region over a few decades. Imagine the psychological impact. Not only were people starving, but the very ground beneath their feet, which they believed to be solid and reliable, was shaking their cities to dust, surely seen as a sign of the gods' utter displeasure. The most personal layer of this new evidence comes from genetics. Ancient DNA analysis is now allowing us to trace population movements and changes with incredible accuracy. By sequencing DNA from skeletal remains from before, during, and after the collapse, scientists can see the genetic impact of these tumultuous events. Early results suggest significant population turnover in some regions, supporting the idea of large-scale migrations and the arrival of new groups who mixed with the local populations. In other areas, there is evidence of remarkable genetic continuity, showing that not everyone was wiped out or replaced. Many people simply adapted to a new, simpler way of life. This genetic narrative adds a profound human dimension, moving beyond the burning palaces to show the actual flow of people, their struggles, and their ultimate survival, proving that the story of the collapse is not a finished book sitting on a shelf, but a living, breathing field of study where every new technological advance writes another page, bringing us closer than ever to the real people who witnessed the end of their world. It is tempting to view the late Bronze Age collapse as a distant, almost mythical event, a dramatic tale of fallen empires and forgotten kings that holds little bearing on our technologically advanced modern world. But to dismiss it as mere ancient history is to miss its most profound and urgent lesson. This was not a unique, one-off catastrophe. It was the first documented case of a globalized, interconnected civilization facing a perfect storm of systemic risks. And in that, it holds up an unsettlingly clear mirror to our own 21st century existence. We too live in an age of incredible interdependence, where a drought in one breadbasket region can spike global food prices, a pandemic can halt international travel and trade, and a conflict in a strategic shipping lane can send shockwaves through the world's economy. Our complex networks of supply chains, digital infrastructure, and financial systems are our version of the Bronze Age's trade routes in tin and copper. Incredibly efficient and productive, but also possessing a hidden fragility that becomes apparent only when the system is severely stressed. The most striking parallel lies in the undeniable role of climate change as a threat multiplier. For the longest time, historians pointed to invasions and wars as the primary cause of the collapse, until scientific evidence revealed the true underlying stressor, a prolonged regional megadrought that lasted for generations. This environmental shift didn't directly topple empires, but it crippled their agricultural base, led to widespread famine, and created waves of desperate climate refugees. Today, we are grappling with our own planetary-scale environmental crisis. We face not a single megadrought, but an escalating pattern of extreme weather events, rising sea levels threatening coastal cities, and shifting climate zones that disrupt agriculture and displace populations. Just like the kings of Hattusa and Ugarit, our global leaders are now confronted with the reality that environmental stress can amplify social unrest, economic instability, and geopolitical tensions, pushing complex societies to a breaking point. The ancient world reminds us that nature is not a separate backdrop to human history. It is an active, powerful participant, and ignoring its signals can have civilization-altering consequences. This ancient case study also forces us to confront the vulnerabilities of our own highly centralized systems. The great Bronze Age palaces were marvels of top-down control and efficiency, but they had no backup plans. When the palace at Pylos burned, the entire economic and administrative system for its entire region vanished with it. Our modern world is built on similar pillars of centralization. We rely on centralized power grids, global financial hubs, and digital cloud infrastructure. A major cyber attack, a solar flare, or a coordinated strike on critical infrastructure could potentially trigger a cascading failure that would be incredibly difficult to contain. The lesson from the past is not that we should abandon complexity, but that we must consciously and deliberately build resilience into our systems. This means investing in redundancy, supporting local food production and energy grids, and designing systems that can continue to function, even in a degraded mode when the central node fails. It is a shift in priority from maximum efficiency to sustainable resilience. Finally, the collapse offers a sobering lesson in the necessity and difficulty of international cooperation. The final days of the Bronze Age show fleeting glimpses of former enemies, the Egyptians and Hittites, attempting to coordinate and honor old mutual defense treaties as their world crumbled around them. Their efforts were likely too little, too late, hampered by slow communication and deep-seated distrust. Our world today faces its own set of transnational threats: pandemics, climate change, nuclear proliferation, that no single nation can solve alone. Addressing these challenges requires a level of global cooperation and trust that often seems elusive, as national interests and short-term political cycles frequently override collective, long-term action. The ashes of Hattusa stand as a silent monument to what can happen when civilizations fail to unite against a common, existential danger. They are a warning from the past, urging us to find a better path, to build stronger international institutions, and to recognize that in an interconnected world, our fates are ultimately bound together. The story of the late Bronze Age collapse is not a prophecy of doom, but a powerful call for foresight, humility, and cooperation, reminding us that the lessons of resilience learned over 3,000 years ago have never been more critically relevant. Perhaps the most persistent and alluring myth is the idea of a single cataclysmic event that brought the Bronze Age to an abrupt and simultaneous end. This narrative paints a picture of a single terrible year where fire rained down from the heavens, earthquakes shattered every city, and a unified horde of invaders swept across the land, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins in their wake. It's a compelling, almost cinematic vision, but it's a dramatic oversimplification that the archaeological record simply doesn't support. The reality was far more complex and, in many ways, more frightening. The collapse wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow-burning fuse that took decades, even generations, to finally reach the powder keg. Different regions fell at different times over a span of about 50 years. A city like Ugarit might have been sacked around 1190 BCE, while the palaces in Greece showed signs of strain and decline for another 30 or 40 years before their final abandonment. This wasn't a synchronized fall. It was a staggered collapse, a wave of failure that rolled across the eastern Mediterranean, hitting each kingdom at its weakest moment. Understanding this timeline is crucial because it reveals a process, not an event, a gradual unraveling where societies had time to react, adapt, and ultimately fail, rather than being instantly wiped out by an unforeseen catastrophe. Closely tied to this is the popular desire to identify a lone villain, a single, satisfying cause for all the chaos. For a long time, the mysterious sea peoples filled this role perfectly. They were the convenient other, the external barbarians at the gate who could be blamed for the downfall of a glorious age. Inscriptions like those of Ramesses III seem to support this, depicting a coordinated naval invasion that was heroically repelled. But to cast them as the sole architects of the collapse is to mistake a symptom for the disease. Think of them not as the cause, but as the final, devastating symptom of a system already in terminal decline. They were likely a mixed group, a combination of displaced climate refugees, opportunistic pirates, and unemployed mercenaries who were themselves products of the very same environmental and economic pressures that were crippling the great empires. Their attacks were devastating, but they were successful precisely because they were targeting kingdoms that were already buckling under the weight of famine, internal rebellion, and economic paralysis. They were the spark that ignited the blaze, but the forest had already been dried out and prepared for burning by decades of drought and systemic stress. Blaming the sea peoples alone is like blaming a single match for a forest fire, while ignoring the months of drought that made the trees so vulnerable. Another common misconception revolves around the idea of a universal and total extinction of people and culture. The image is one of abandoned cities, empty landscapes, and a complete break in human history. This idea of a blank slate is powerfully evocative, but it's fundamentally inaccurate. While it's true that major urban centers were destroyed and political systems vanished, the human population did not simply disappear. People are remarkably resilient. What we see in the archaeological record is not depopulation but urbanization and decentralization. When the palaces fell, people didn't vanish, they moved. They retreated from the vulnerable coastal plains and large, centralized cities to smaller, more defensible hilltop settlements. Life became more local, more rural, and undoubtedly harder, but it continued. Cultural traditions, technological knowledge, and oral histories persisted, albeit in altered and simplified forms. The skills of potting, farming, and metalworking didn't vanish. They were adapted to a new, smaller-scale reality. The so-called Dark Age that followed was not a period of utter emptiness but one of transformation, where the old, rigid hierarchies broke down and made way for new, more flexible social structures to eventually emerge. It was a period of simplification, not obliteration. Finally, there's a modern temptation to view the collapse through a moralistic lens, to see it as a form of divine or karmic retribution for the sins of the elite, their opulence, their inequality, their corruption. While it's true that social inequality and top-heavy governance were significant vulnerabilities, framing the collapse as a moral reckoning is a dangerous oversimplification. It implies a kind of deserved outcome which ignores the immense suffering of the common people who bore the brunt of the disaster. The farmers who starved in the drought, the families caught in the burning cities, the refugees forced from their homes, they were not being punished for the excesses of their rulers. They were the victims of a complex interplay of environmental and systemic failures that were beyond their control or comprehension. This misconception can prevent us from learning the most important lessons of the collapse. It encourages us to see it as a unique moral failing of a specific culture, rather than a case study in the vulnerabilities of any complex, interconnected civilization. The lesson isn't that the Bronze Age kings were particularly wicked. It's that all centralized systems, regardless of their morality, are vulnerable to cascading failure when faced with multiple, simultaneous crises. By moving past these compelling but flawed narratives, we can engage with the collapse on its own complex terms, appreciating the intricate web of causes and effects that truly shaped one of the most pivotal turning points in human history. Behind the sweeping narratives of toppled empires and vanished trade routes, there were countless personal worlds being shattered. History often remembers the pharaohs and the burned palaces, but it is in the quiet, desperate words of ordinary people that we feel the true weight of this catastrophe. Consider the merchant, a figure who had thrived in the globalized Bronze Age. For generations, his family had operated out of Ugarit, part of a sophisticated network that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia. He knew the exchange rates for silver, the best routes for transporting Cypriot copper, and the going price for Babylonian textiles. His wealth and identity were built on a foundation of peaceful, predictable commerce. Then, almost without warning, the world he knew began to close in on itself. The familiar ships stopped arriving. Letters from trading partners in Hattusa or Mycenaean became frantic, then ceased altogether. The system of credit and trust that had allowed his business to flourish evaporated, replaced by a pervasive fear of the unknown. His carefully maintained ledgers, once a record of profit and connection, were now useless. The final, heartbreaking artifact from this man's life might be a hastily written tablet found in the kiln unsent, not about a business deal, but a desperate plea for news of a missing ship carrying his son. His story is one of a world becoming smaller, darker, and infinitely more dangerous, where a lifetime of knowledge was rendered obsolete in a matter of months. Then there were the farmers, the silent majority who formed the bedrock of every Bronze Age kingdom. Their connection to the crisis was not through interrupted trade routes, but through the very soil they worked. They were the first to feel the changing climate, watching with growing dread as season after season brought insufficient rain. The sun, once a source of life, became an enemy, baking their fields into cracked, barren plains. The tax collectors from the palace would still arrive, demanding their share of a harvest that did not exist. We can imagine the agonizing choices they faced. Do they consume the last of their seed grain to feed their starving children, ensuring immediate survival but sacrificing next year's crop? As the famine tightened its grip, their loyalty to a distant king who could no longer provide protection or sustenance would have withered away. Many would have made the difficult decision to abandon the ancestral lands that had defined their family for centuries, joining the growing streams of displaced people moving in search of food. A single clay pot found overturned in the corner of a small, abandoned farmhouse becomes a poignant symbol of this rupture. It represents the moment everything they had built was left behind, a life sacrificed to the desperate hope of finding somewhere, anywhere, that could offer a meal and a moment of safety. The soldiers of this era experienced a different kind of disillusionment. A professional soldier in the service of the Hittite king or the Egyptian pharaoh was part of a proud, organized institution. He was equipped with state-of-the-art bronze weapons and armor, his identity forged in the power of the empire he served. But as the crises mounted, that sense of order would have crumbled. He might have found himself stationed on a lonely frontier post, watching the supply convoys become less frequent and of poorer quality. The prized bronze spearhead he was issued might have been old and worn, with no new shipments of tin available to forge a replacement. Instead of facing a recognizable enemy army in a set-piece battle, he would have been confronted by ragged, desperate bands of migrants, whole families armed with nothing but clubs and desperation, whom he was ordered to cut down without mercy. The psychological toll of such a duty, defending a crumbling border for a state that could no longer feed its own people, must have been immense. A single, bent and nicked bronze sword, found buried near the gates of a remote fort, tells this story. It speaks of long, grinding service, poor maintenance, and ultimately, either abandonment or a last, futile stand against an overwhelming and confusing foe. Perhaps the most visceral human stories come from the refugees themselves, those who history has lumped together under the ominous label of the Sea Peoples. They were not a faceless horde, but a collection of individuals whose worlds had already ended. A mother bundling her few precious belongings, a cherished necklace, a small carving of a household god, into a cloth before fleeing her burning village. A father trying to calm his children's fears as they crowded onto a rickety boat, heading out into the terrifying open sea toward an unknown future. Their migration was not a choice but a necessity, a violent, desperate search for a new home. The personal items found in their graves, often a mix of cultural styles from their homeland and new influences from the places they passed through, show people trying to hold onto their identity even as they were forced to adapt to survive. They were both victims and, out of that victimization, sometimes perpetrators of violence, caught in a horrific cycle where the need to feed one's own family justified taking from others. Their journey was one of unimaginable loss and resilience, a testament to the human will to persist even when every familiar landmark, both physical and cultural, has been erased from the map. These individual stories, preserved in fragments of clay and metal, are the true heart of the collapse. They transform a historical event into a human experience. They remind us that the end of the Bronze Age was not just about the fall of mighty Hattusa, but about the family that hid their valuables under the floorboards as the smoke grew closer, hoping to one day return. It was not just about the collapse of the tin trade, but about the blacksmith who looked at his empty workshop and knew his life's work was over. By focusing on these personal moments of fear, courage, and despair, we understand that history is never inevitable or abstract. It is the sum of millions of individual choices made in impossible circumstances, a powerful reminder that behind every artifact unearthed by an archaeologist's trowel, there was once a person who lived, loved, and struggled to make sense of a world falling apart around them. While the fires of collapse burned brightest in the palaces of the Eastern Mediterranean, the shockwaves from this civilizational earthquake traveled far beyond, rippling across continents and reshaping societies that had never even heard of a Hittite king or a Mycenaean wanax. This was not a regional event, it was a global one, a demonstration of how interconnected the ancient world truly was, even 3,000 years ago. To understand the full magnitude of the late Bronze Age collapse, we must pull the camera back for a truly planetary view, tracing the lines of disruption as they radiated outward from the epicenter, touching the lives of people from the foggy forests of Central Europe to the sun-baked plains of the Indian subcontinent. The collapse of this sophisticated international system created a power vacuum and a chain reaction of movement that would reverberate for centuries, proving that no civilization, no matter how isolated it seemed, was an island entire of itself. One of the most significant ripple effects was the severing of the vital amber road trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with the Baltic Sea. For centuries, prized amber from northern Europe had traveled south, exchanged for finely crafted bronze weapons, tools, and jewelry produced in the workshops of Mycenaean Greece and other major centers. This was a lucrative and well-established exchange, bringing northern chieftains not just wealth but also prestige goods that reinforced their social status. When the palatial economies of Greece collapsed, the production of these luxury bronze items ceased almost overnight. The demand for amber in the south evaporated, and the flow of finished goods northward stopped dead. The archaeological record in Central Europe shows a dramatic shift right around 1200 BCE. Elite burials, once filled with imported bronze swords and ornate vessels, suddenly contain far fewer of these status symbols. This economic shock likely destabilized the social order of the Urnfield culture in Central Europe, as chieftains lost their primary source of external wealth and prestige. In the power vacuum that followed, we see the rise of new regional powers and a period of increased conflict, as societies that had grown dependent on long-distance trade were forced to adapt to a new, more isolated reality, setting the stage for the cultural changes that would define the Iron Age in that region. This disruption also triggered a domino effect of migration and cultural diffusion, a great shuffling of populations that pushed people across the map like pieces on a board. As the so-called Sea Peoples moved into the Levant and as other groups were displaced from the collapsing Hittite sphere in Anatolia, they pushed against their neighbors who in turn pushed against theirs. This series of population pressures is believed to have contributed to a chain of events that reached the Caucasus Mountains and the eastern edges of the Black Sea. Here, the sophisticated kingdom of Urartu and other smaller polities began to feel the indirect effects of the chaos to their west. Some scholars suggest that the breakdown of order may have allowed for the greater movement of skilled metalworkers, perhaps including groups who carried with them the advanced ironworking techniques that were becoming a necessity in a world starved of tin. This technological knowledge, born from the desperation of the collapse, began to spread along these new pathways of migration, slowly transforming military and economic realities far from its point of origin. The reverberations may have even traveled as far as the Indian subcontinent, though the connections here are more complex and debated by scholars. The great Indus Valley civilization, known as the Harappan culture, had already declined centuries earlier, but its legacy societies persisted. Around the time of the Bronze Age collapse in the West, we see significant changes in the archaeological record of northwestern India. There is a notable increase in the number of fortified settlements, suggesting a new period of instability and conflict. Intriguingly, this period also coincides with the composition of the earliest hymns of the Rigveda, the most ancient Hindu sacred text. Some historians and linguists have proposed that the authors of these hymns, a people who called themselves Aryans, may have begun a more pronounced migration into the subcontinent around this time, possibly spurred on by the same broader climatic or population displacements that were affecting Eurasia. Whether this was a direct result of the collapse or part of a broader pattern of movement, it illustrates how a major event in one part of the ancient world could create conditions that influenced cultural and political developments thousands of miles away, weaving together the destinies of seemingly separate civilizations. Perhaps the most profound impact on a distant region was the unintentional creation of opportunities for entirely new powers to rise. With the Hittite Empire utterly vanquished, the great imperial anchor of Anatolia was gone. And with the Mycenaean palaces and the merchant kingdom of Ugarit destroyed, the powerful maritime influence of the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean was drastically reduced. This collapse of established power structures left a vast sphere of influence up for grabs. In this new world, smaller, more agile groups could expand their reach without facing the organized resistance of a major empire. The Phoenicians, as we've seen, seized this opportunity to become the new masters of the Mediterranean sea lanes. But further east, another group was positioned to benefit: the Assyrians. With their primary rivals, the Hittites, removed from the board, and with Egypt withdrawing into itself, the Assyrians found themselves without any major competitors in the Near East. After a period of consolidation during the worst of the crisis, they began a relentless expansion from their Mesopotamian heartland, eventually building the vast Neo-Assyrian Empire, the first true military superpower of the Iron Age. The collapse of the Bronze Age world order did not just destroy, it cleared the stage, creating a geopolitical vacuum that allowed for the rise of new empires that would dominate the next chapter of human history, their ascent made possible by the downfall of giants they had never even known. Yet from the smoldering ruins and the profound silence that followed, a new world did not simply reappear, it was painstakingly invented. The centuries after the collapse were not a swift return to glory, but a long, slow climb out of the darkness, a period of struggle and adaptation where survivors had to rebuild everything from the ground up, often with little more than fragmented memories of what had been lost. This was not a restoration of the old order, it was a fundamental reinvention of society itself. The grand, top-down empires were gone, and in their place emerged smaller, more agile, and often more resilient communities. People moved from the vulnerable coastal plains and burned cities to fortified hilltop settlements. Life became more local and power decentralized. This fragmentation, while born from disaster, created a vacuum, a blank slate of sorts, that allowed for breathtaking experimentation in technology, governance, and culture. The collapse had burned away the old, rigid structures, and from that fertilized soil, entirely new ways of being human began to grow. One of the most revolutionary innovations to emerge from this crucible was the alphabet, a stunning simplification of communication that stood in stark contrast to the complex, elitist writing systems of the Bronze Age. In the aftermath, the intricate scripts of the palace's Akkadian cuneiform with its hundreds of signs and Linear B with its complex syllabaries vanished because the vast bureaucratic apparatus that supported them had ceased to exist. Literacy, once the exclusive domain of a small, powerful scribble class, was virtually lost, but necessity is the mother of invention. Sometime in the turbulent early Iron Age, likely in the context of bustling trade between Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, a Semitic-speaking people made a brilliant conceptual leap. They took a small subset of Egyptian hieroglyphic characters and repurposed them, not to represent whole words or complex syllables, but to represent simple consonant sounds. This was the Proto-Sinaitic script, the humble ancestor of every alphabet used in the Western world today. This breakthrough was then refined and perfected by the Phoenicians, those master adapters of the New Age. Their 22-letter alphabet was a tool of pure efficiency, designed for merchants to keep accounts and traders to mark goods. It was easy to learn, requiring mastery of only a few dozen characters instead of hundreds, which democratized literacy in a way that was unimaginable in the age of the palace scribes. This technology of empowerment would eventually be adopted and enhanced by the Greeks, who added vowels, creating a writing system so versatile it could capture the nuances of epic poetry, philosophical argument, and democratic law. The alphabet is perhaps the ultimate legacy of the collapse, a tool born from pragmatic need that would ultimately unlock the full potential of human thought and expression for generations to come. On the rocky peninsula of Greece, the long twilight of the Dark Age gave birth to a political experiment that would forever change the world: the concept of citizenship. The Mycenaean world had been ruled by a wanax, an absolute monarch whose authority flowed from the palace and its centralized economy. When those palaces fell, that model of kingship disintegrated with them. In its place, slowly, a new form of community organization began to crystallize: the polis, or city-state. These were not vast empires but small, fiercely independent communities where identity was rooted in shared space and shared laws rather than loyalty to a distant, godlike king. The mountainous terrain of Greece naturally fostered this independence, isolating communities and forcing them to become self-reliant. Within these polis, the old, rigid hierarchies of the Bronze Age softened. The chaos of the collapse had, in a brutal way, leveled the playing field. To survive, these small states had to mobilize all their able-bodied men for defense, creating a new class of citizen soldiers who fought not for a monarch but for their own homes and their own laws. This created a powerful new sense of ownership and participation in public life. From this fertile ground, first in places like Athens, emerged the earliest notions of democracy, the radical idea that governance could be a collective enterprise, a shared responsibility of the citizens themselves. This was a direct rejection of the top-down, autocratic model of the Bronze Age and a stunning testament to the human capacity to build something more equitable from the ashes of absolute power. And from the geopolitical vacuum left by the fallen Hittite and Egyptian empires, new powers arose, forged in the harsh realities of the Iron Age and fundamentally different from their predecessors. The most formidable of these was the Neo-Assyrian Empire. While the coastal powers were ravaged by the sea peoples, the Assyrians, nestled further inland in their heartland around the Tigris River, held on. They endured the crisis, learned from it, and built a new kind of military machine. Theirs was an empire built on iron, not bronze, a reflection of the new technological reality. They perfected organized, terrifyingly efficient warfare, using it to create history's first true military superpower, which dominated the Near East for centuries. But the most enduring legacy of this period of rebirth was not an empire at all. It was a revolution in thought. In the power vacuum of the Levant, freed from the cultural domination of Egypt and Hatti, small groups like the Israelites began to forge a new spiritual identity. Theirs was a radical shift from the polytheistic pantheons that had underpinned the Bronze Age kingdoms. They developed a profound monotheism, a covenant with a single, universal God that was not tied to a specific palace or pharaoh. This was a faith born in the crucible of collapse, a search for meaning and order in a world that had proven terrifyingly fragile. It offered a new kind of resilience, not through imperial power, but through faith, community, and a shared moral law. This spiritual innovation, alongside the political experiments in Greece and the technological leaps of the Phoenicians, shows that the true legacy of the late Bronze Age collapse was not just survival, but transformation. It proves that from the deepest darkness can come the most brilliant light, and that the end of one world is always and inevitably the beginning of the next. So as we stand here, looking back across more than 3,000 years at the rubble of Hattusa and the silent workshops of the Mycenaeans, it's only natural to turn that gaze inward and ask what this all means for us right now in this moment. History is never just about the past. It's a conversation with the present, a mirror reflecting our own deepest challenges and anxieties. The story of the late Bronze Age collapse isn't a closed book. It's an open question, and perhaps the most important one we can ask is this. In our own era of breathtaking globalization and dizzying technological progress, are we, too, building a magnificent but fragile palace, unaware of the tremors gathering beneath our feet? Think about the parallels for a moment. Our world is woven together by supply chains that stretch across the entire planet, digital networks that move information at the speed of light, and financial systems so interconnected that a crisis in one market can trigger a panic in another. This is our version of the Bronze Age's trade in tin and copper, a system of incredible efficiency and wealth that also contains profound, hidden vulnerabilities. The pandemic gave us a small, sharp taste of what a major disruption feels like: empty shelves, factory shutdowns, and the stark realization of how dependent we are on the smooth functioning of a system we rarely even think about. The ancient world reminds us that complexity, for all its benefits, can create a kind of rigidity, a system that is brilliant in good times but has very few backup plans for when things go seriously wrong. So where is the line? How do we, as a global society, reap the incredible benefits of our interconnectedness while also building in the buffers, the redundancies, and the local resilience that would allow our communities to weather a major storm? Is it possible to have both the bounty of a globalized world and the security of a self-reliant one? And then there's the undeniable shadow of climate change, the great threat multiplier. The ancient megadrought, revealed to us through tree rings and sediment cores, shows us that environmental stress doesn't just cause bad weather, it unravels societies. It pushes people from their homes, strains resources to the breaking point, and forces impossible choices upon leaders. We are now the architects of our own climate shift, and the signs are all around us, from intensifying wildfires and superstorms to shifting agricultural zones and rising seas. The lesson from the past is not that climate change alone causes collapse, but that it acts as a catalyst, amplifying every other weakness in the system, social, economic, and political. It asks us a very direct question: what are we doing right now to build a society that is not just efficient but resilient, to create systems of food and energy that can withstand the shocks we know are coming? The kings of the Bronze Age had no idea the drought was coming. We have no such excuse. Their story is a warning we have the unique privilege to actually heed. This all leads to the most human question of all. In a crisis, do we turn inward or do we reach out? The final, fleeting alliances between the Egyptians and Hittites show us that even the bitterest of rivals can recognize a common enemy. But they also show us that cooperation, when it comes from a place of desperation and mistrust, is often too little, too late. Our global challenges, the pandemic, climate change, nuclear proliferation, are the sea peoples of our time. They pay no heed to national borders. They cannot be solved by any one nation building a higher wall. The ancient collapse asks us if we have the wisdom and the will to build the kind of international cooperation and trust that is proactive rather than reactive. Can we forge our alliances before the fire is at the gate, not after? Can we see our shared humanity not as an abstract ideal, but as the most practical and essential tool for our collective survival? These aren't questions with easy answers, and that's precisely why they are so vital to ask. The study of history isn't about finding a neat blueprint to follow. It's about gaining perspective, about seeing the patterns and the pitfalls so we can navigate our own path with a little more wisdom. So we'd love to hear what you think. As you reflect on this story of collapse and resilience, what parallels do you see that feel most urgent to you? Where do you find hope? How do you think we can best balance our deep global connections with the need for local strength? Share your thoughts and your questions in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going, because the greatest lesson of the past might just be that the future is a story we all write together. The story of the late Bronze Age collapse is far more than an ancient mystery. It is a profound and enduring lesson etched into the very bedrock of human history. It teaches us that no civilization, no matter how magnificent or seemingly permanent, is immune to the complex interplay of environmental shifts, economic fragility, and social unrest. We have walked through the ashes of mighty Hattusa and heard the final, desperate words of a king in Ugarit, and in doing so, we have witnessed a truth that resonates across the millennia. Our greatest strengths, like intricate global networks and cultural achievements, can also contain the seeds of our greatest vulnerabilities. This was not a simple story of invaders toppling statues. It was a systemic failure, a cascade where climate change led to famine, famine led to migration, migration led to conflict, and conflict exposed every hidden weakness in a rigid, interconnected world. The collapse was a brutal reset, but it was also a crucible. From its fires emerged not just darkness, but the sparks of alphabets, new forms of governance, and spiritual revolutions that would eventually light the way to the classical world and beyond. This journey through the past holds up an inescapable mirror to our present. We too live in an age of stunning globalization, of just-in-time supply chains and digital networks that span the globe. We too face the escalating pressures of a changing climate, watching as droughts intensify and weather patterns shift, threatening agricultural stability and displacing populations. The parallels are not merely academic, they are an urgent call to humility and foresight. The kings and merchants of the Bronze Age could not have predicted the perfect storm that awaited them, but we have the advantage of hindsight. We can see the patterns, we can understand that resilience is not about building higher walls, but about fostering more flexible and adaptable systems. It is about recognizing that our fates are inextricably linked, that a crisis anywhere can quickly become a crisis everywhere, and that our only true security lies in building a world with more redundancy, more cooperation, and more shared purpose. Ultimately, the most powerful legacy of this collapse is a message of hope, forged in the deepest despair. It is the incredible human capacity for resilience and reinvention. After the palaces fell and the writing faded, people did not vanish. They adapted. They moved to the hills, they learned to work iron, they formed new communities, and they carried their stories with them. They found a way forward. This is the heart of the human story, our relentless ability to persevere, to innovate, and to build anew, even from the rubble. As we face our own uncertain future with its own set of global challenges, we can carry this lesson forward. We can choose to learn from the past, to prioritize sustainability over short-term gain, to value cooperation over conflict, and to build a future that is not only more efficient, but more resilient, more equitable, and more compassionate. Thank you so much for exploring this incredible chapter of history with us. If these stories from the deep past have given you a new perspective, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to join us as we continue to unravel the mysteries of our shared human story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel.